All right, hour number 2 here on a Monday. Chris Brown, Chris Trapasso with you here on One Bills Live, and pleased to be joined now by USA Today editor and NFL writer. And you'll also find him on the X's and O's podcast with our good friend Greg Cosell. It's Doug Farrar joining us here in the throes of the offseason, but Doug is always crunching tape and coming up with formulas and trends that are developing in the league, and we wanted to get him on for this one in particular. His latest write-up at SBNation.com, NFL teams don't need a number one wide receiver, and here is why. Doug, first, thanks for the time. Second, the Bills and their current receiving core would seemingly fall into this category. We have somewhat of a track record of success with this, Chiefs being the most notable. Packers with a nice run last year without a true number one. So, I mean, you could even argue the Lions, if you don't think a slot receiver can be an alpha number one guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown. So, do we see this as a growing thing, or is it too early to tell?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. If it's true, it's good news for Bills fans, right? Because you're kind of looking at the receiver core going, okay, well, and you could argue that Stephon Diggs, as good as he was in his prime, maybe he wasn't that number one guy anymore, more of a possession, less ADOT, less downfield stuff, and maybe that was more Gabe Davis last year. But you start with how you define a number one receiver, the guy who can take your best cornerback and have answers for him, the guy who can always beat press, the guy who can always beat brackets, the guy who, no matter what route he runs, he's just a problem, and you sort of have to take too much of your defense aligned to that guy, and now you have other guys open. That's the other aspect of it. And I think there are some teams that, and I've been doing some work on this for a couple months, just on the concept of needing a number one receiver as all these guys were getting huge deals. And then about 3 weeks ago, I saw some quotes from Jordan Love, the quarterback of the Packers, during minicamp saying, you know what? We don't have a number one receiver per se, like that alpha guy. And actually, I prefer it because we can align our receivers in all these different ways and use all these motions and condensed formations and all these things. And it's harder for the defense to have a beat on what we're doing. We can run Romeo Dubs in this, cross motion out of trips on one play, and it's Jaden Reed on the next one. And, depending on the skill set, Dubs is running the in cut and the other two guys are running the vertical routes. And now it's Reed, and it's just different ways to get your guys open without having to put so much, not only resources financially, but resources on the field. Tom Brady was recently on Colin Cowherd's show talking about when you have a number one receiver, you really need to focus on getting the ball to him so he's not running a bunch of routes over and over and not catching the ball and getting frustrated. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's great if you have a Randy Moss in his prime or a Gronk, but, Brady won probably more Super Bowls without that number one receiver.
Yeah.
He had a bunch of guys that worked well in the scheme. So moving forward, as teams are looking at resource allocation, do we want to be like the Dolphins and give Tyreek Hill the deal after the trade and then give Jalen Waddle the big deal? Well, that's how they want to define it. That's how they want to build it. Other teams might say, you know what, we can't really do that because we want to focus on our edge guys and our corners and our safeties, or we want to have the best offensive line. And the thing about paying that $30 million a year AAV to one receiver, he'd better be a Justin Jefferson or a Jamar Chase, because the minute he isn't, you are really stuck from a personnel perspective because you put that much room, that much resource into one guy. And now, well, who's your number two? How did you build the rest of your receiver room, or did you over-rely on this one guy? So I think teams are just kind of looking at the whole picture. I don't know that it's a trend. I would say that a lot of times it's, well, we can't get that guy, so let's just do the best we can with what we have. But I do think that the idea that you can't have a really great passing game without a number one, that was kind of what I was looking at, and I think that's a bit of a canard. I think you can have a passing game that's just fine without that alpha guy.
My question, reading this article and kind of understanding how this has come about with the Chiefs, obviously winning back-to-back Super Bowls, the Packers, like you mentioned, even the 49ers, if you don't want to include Brandon Ayuk as a true bona fide number one, the tight end position, because I think those teams also have pretty good tight ends. The Chiefs use 12 and 13 personnel a ton. You mentioned that. Tom Brady, like you're mentioning, that had those quotes, had Aaron Hernandez, had Rob Gronkowski's, that they usually had good tight ends. The Bills, with Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox, certainly should be prominent figures. How important actually is the tight end position in teams being able to go away from that true number one wide receiver philosophy?
Right. We talk about the Chiefs and saying they won the Super Bowl without the number one receiver. I mean, honestly, guys, I don't think they would have made the Super Bowl without Spags' defense. I don't know if they would have made the playoffs without Spags' defense. That passing game was pretty bad. But they did have a thing. They have led the league in 13 personnel, 3 tight ends, both of the last 2 seasons, which you think the Chiefs, high flying, whatever, you wouldn't think so. And one of their primary concepts was to put all 3 of their tight ends in a tight bunch formation and have the other tight ends rolling vertically. So Travis Kelce would have that designed opening underneath. Mm-hmm. So they're different. And as you guys know, before they gave Dawson Knox the big deal, and before they, they really, the Bills focused on their tight end position. Before that, they in 2021 they had the fewest snaps of 12 personnel, 2 tight ends in the league. The year after that, it was 31st. Last year, it went up to about middle of the pack. But they clearly see Knox and Kincaid as, force multipliers in their passing game. And, when I did Kincaid's tape, he was my TE1 in that class. He has Kelce attributes. He can work the seam. He's great on crossers. He has a dynamite understanding of how to get open in zones, how to fill those voids that are left open by zone coverage. So they've got that. And they've got, Keon Coleman, first-round pick, big, fast ball winner, struggles against press more than you might expect. But he wasn't pressed a lot in college because they know if you do that too much, the guy's just going to Godzilla your cornerback, and then you have a problem. So when you look at the Bills and how they're aligning with, without Gabe Davis, without Stephon Diggs, and now it's Coleman, and it's Samuel, and it's MVS, and it's Chase Claypool. And they've got a bunch of parts that Joe Brady now has to figure out the best plans for. And Josh Allen, and I got to interview Josh about a month ago, and he was talking about all the different things that he wants to do in Joe Brady's offense and how it's less rudimentary, which I thought was an interesting way to put it. And so maybe Josh is more of that point guard. It's getting the ball to the open guy, and maybe through condensed formations, which the Niners and the Packers and the Chiefs love to do, and the Bills don't do a lot. They prefer to spread it out. But however you do it, getting those guys open through scheme, as opposed to, oh, well, gosh, we don't have a number one guy, so what are we going to do now? Can your number one guys become your tight ends? Sure. Or they're part of the distribution and you don't have a number one guy. And as Jordan Love posited, it's actually an advantage because there's nowhere to really focus at the snap. It could be any one of 5 guys, and that becomes tough for a defense.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into my next question, because I think you've seen enough of Josh Allen on tape to know that even in year 6 of his career last year, there are still times when he leaves the pocket too early, or unnecessarily does so. Yeah. Do you believe that this approach that Joe Brady is undertaking with this receiving core can also in turn help Josh play within structure more?
Sure, and part of that was, and we don't really know what Joe Brady's offense is going to be. When you replace a coordinator halfway through the season, you're just whipsawing it together. You don't really know. And Josh intimated to me when I talked to him a month ago that there are going to be a lot of different aspects of this offense. You would expect that to be so. So how that works, we'll see. A lot of those, when quarterbacks leave the pocket too early, there are a number of reasons for that. Here is one. But we talk about coverage sacks and coverage pressures. If you're too reliant on that number one guy or even the number 2 guy, and you're like, oh gosh, my first read is gone, now my second read is gone. If the reads are based on receiver talent or receiver ability to get open, as opposed to if I can run through quick reads, and this is something that Brock Purdy, by the way, was really good at. And it's one reason that, and I would agree that Brandon Ayuk is more of a 1A than a true alpha dog. But it's one reason the Niners passing game worked so well is Purdy could just clock through his reads very quickly. And he knew, because he had Kyle Shanahan, that those reads were going to be open within the structure of the play for the most part. He didn't get nervous feet. He didn't start to flip out thinking, well, it's about half or half. My first read is going to be open. That's when any quarterback gets into trouble. I don't care if you're Tom Brady. It's going to be a problem over time. So it behooves Joe Brady to scheme these things open and have designs that give Josh that quicker, not easy read necessarily, but quicker. And I know you guys wanted to talk about defensive tackles too, and that quick pressure right up there's so much more quick game. The Bills are a heavy RPO team. There's a lot of quick game going on.
Right.
So a lot of times it's not the pressure because the pressure doesn't have time to get there. It's and this is true for any great quarterback, as I said, it's not just the new guys. If all of a sudden the picture is muddy, it happens to Mahomes. It just things start to break down. So as you said, if Josh can have reads that are more just I know where it is, bang, I go, and it's more that point guard mentality, the explosive plays will come from that over the time. But if you're depending too much on the intermediate and deep stuff, that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, let's talk about defensive tackles now. Kind of moving on with the Bills getting the breakout season from Matt Oliver last year after signing the big deal. They draft Dwayne Carter in the third round out of Duke. Explain to the viewers and the listeners why. I mean, we always hear about edge rushers; they get the big bucks. Defensive tackle, that position financially has really increased a lot. Why is that position more important now than maybe it was even 5 or 10 years ago?
You go back to quick game. I mean, that's really it's a pretty easy answer because for what like let's say a 1 to 3 step drop, it's 1.5 to maybe 1.8 seconds before the ball comes out. I don't care who your edge rusher is. He's not going to have time to get there. Maybe a pressure, maybe if the quarterback floats in the pocket or goes backward in the pocket, which you never want, maybe he can get a pressure there. But a lot of times, there's just no way. Even if the edge rusher is unblocked, a razor call or something like that, to the quarterback, he can't get there in 1.8 seconds. Shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And it's why a guy like Dexter Lawrence is so important. Ed Oliver has become really important in that regard. So I did a study, and Greg Cosell and I talked about it too, about the best interior pass rushers with quick pressure against 1 to 3 step drops. And Ed Oliver was on that list. He had, per Pro Football Focus, who counts half sacks as whole sacks, 11 sacks and 72 total pressures overall. 3 of those sacks and 18 of those pressures came in 1 to 3 step drops.
Wow.
So Ed's getting pressure against quick game. And when you can do that, that is a force multiplier in your defense. In the larger sense, I would say that defensive tackles, interior defensive linemen are more important simply because they don't have to skirt the edge. They don't have to do an inside counter. If they can beat the guard and we saw this with Brady in the 2 Super Bowls that the Patriots lost to the Giants. When Justin Tuck got right up the pocket, right in Brady's face, Brady wants to move up. So if you prevent your quarterback from moving up, you're taking away parts of the playbook. So that's why so many interior defensive linemen are being paid at a level they just weren't before. 10 years ago, it was Aaron Donald and a bunch of guys making $5 million a year. Now teams are investing in that position more and more because they understand the importance of quick pressure right up the middle to disrupt the RPOs. The quick stuff outside, the flat routes, the quick slants, all those things that go into more the modern passing game where it is more quick game than it has been before.
And we've seen, the Bills jump into a turbo package, and I realize they're not the only team to do that in obvious passing situations, but they'll move Rousseau down inside where they've got a veritable tree next to Oliver. I wonder, the reach there is the obvious asset, and just getting his hands up to bat a pass down can be a win on a given snap.
Yeah.
But do you believe that with the difficulty with quick game that more teams might move their longer, lankier ends down inside in those obvious passing situations?
Yeah, it's a really good point. As great as J.J. Watt was at everything else, he was a master at timing those batted passes. He would get, I think, 10 or 12 a year. And you're not losing yardage, but as far as the end result, it's almost as good as a sack because the ball goes nowhere. Maybe it's intercepted. You don't know. Obviously, defensive coordinators are becoming more varied and multiple in their defensive line looks. So, yes, absolutely. And, you want those guys who can get their hands up. Ed's not a big guy. He's about 280 in season weight. So his job is to be more disruptive. And yes, maybe you want a linebacker mugging the quarterback and trying to get his hand up. So yes, teams will do all kinds of things, all kinds of TT stunts. The Cowboys were great at that under Dan Quinn. The Titans were great at that with Jeffrey Simmons and Denico Autry. So yes, you are trying to create all different kinds of pressure in the interior where you can get to the quarterback in half the steps, which half the steps, half the seconds. It's easier to do that math than it is to waiting for your edge rusher to get to a guy when he's throwing the ball after taking one step back.
Last one for me. This can be quick. We've seen the defensive tackle position, like we mentioned, financially just kind of blow up over the last couple of years because of the Aaron Donalds, the Chris Jones, Ed Olivers. The safety position really hasn't. How important do you think the safety spot is? And I ask this because the Bills obviously moved on from Jordan Poyer. They draft Cole Bishop. They're going to have some new faces at the safety spot in 2024.
Yeah, and Taylor Rapp, who I thought had a pretty good year last year. It depends. Well, the safety positions changed so much. I noticed this doing draft prospects 3 years ago. All of a sudden, it wasn't strong and free. It was all these safeties were playing, generalizing a quarter free, a quarter in the box, maybe almost half in the slot, and a few blitzes.
Doing a lot.
All of a sudden, the slot position became a lot more important for safeties. And I think in today's NFL, unless you can play the deep third at an Ed Reed or an Earl Thomas level, you had better be able to play 3 or 4 positions really well. The Bills have always liked interchangeable safeties. I think Cole Bishop fits that really well. But unless you're a Kyle Hamilton, where you're standing out that way, I think the financial schism at the safety position is that the position itself is being redefined. It's not like we used to think of Cam Chancellor's in the box and Earl Thomas is in the third. It's more he's over here, he's over there. The Packers, I mean, they got Xavier McKinney from the Giants, then they drafted 2 do-it-all safeties in 2024. 3 new safeties to do all these different things. Safeties are not being paid the way they were, and the safety market tends to fluctuate anyway. I remember this same sort of thing happening about 7 years ago. I think it's fluctuating now because the position itself is being redefined. It's sort of hard to put an absolute dot on what a safety is. More often than not, the answer to that question is what a safety is he's a lot of things, and you'd better be good at all of them.
Yeah.
Because we were just talking earlier in the show, Doug, about how you still have some pretty big name safeties and corners, for that matter, still out in the market. I mean, at the start of the market opening in free agency, there were 22 starters entering free agency at the safety position, and there's still probably about a half a dozen left sitting out there, including Justin Simmons. But to your point, it's the change in definition of what those positions are demanding of the players that play them, and maybe some of these guys on the wrong side of 30 can't do everything anymore.
Well, I would say it also depends. It's not agnostic. Every team, every defensive coordinator, and every defensive backs coach has a different concept of what they want their safeties to do. And it's not just one guy, it's how do you fit in. Well, Justin Simmons has been a great player for a long time, and all 32 defensive staffs and head coaches and GMs and money guys have to figure out, okay, well, how would Justin Simmons, what does he do best at this age, at this time in his NFL career, and how does that fit into what we do? Or can we get a guy who can do 80% of that in the 4th round?
Yeah.
And that's,
great point.
That's kind of where guys like Simmons run into trouble. Yeah. And that's true for any position. Like I said, with safeties, it's just weird right now because the position is changing in and of itself.
Yeah. Good discussion, Doug. Thanks for the time. We appreciate it as always. Enjoy what you got left of the offseason here. It's going to come up fast.
Yes, it is. Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate it.